Can everyone please mute their mics?
Okay, so I will go ahead and begin. So it's great to see you all. Thanks so much for coming. Great to see so many of you here to discuss the important issue of how the university use academic metrics in making decisions, particularly about hiring, tenure, where that in context where that occurs, and that's relevant. It's not in the UK, and redundancies. So I suspect that people are here for many different reasons. Some of you will be here because you know about the situation in Liverpool and you're interested in that. Some will be here because you're interested in the broader issue of research metrics and how they're used. So for the latter group, I just wanted to give a brief 1 minute overview of what's going on in Liverpool to give that context. David, did you want to share in the chat a link to a sort of longer description of that?
Yes, I'll do that now, Colin. Sure.
Okay, great. So, in January, the University of Liverpool informed 47 members of academic staff in the School of Health and Life Sciences that they were being targeted for redundancy. So it's important. So redundancies happen at universities. This one slightly different in that it was not an act born of financial necessity. The reason it was given was that these particular faculty were underperforming and that shedding these staff would allow reinvestment in other staff, which would then improve the faculty's performance. The staff were at that point selected based on 2 metrics. The first is that they fell below a grant income threshold for their REF unit of assessment. Apologies to anyone who's not in the UK who doesn't know about what the REF is. And the second one is that they had a field-weighted citation index of below 2. So the staff had not been aware of these targets in advance. These had never been targets that had ever been set to staff at Liverpool, nor were they given the chance to see the data used. So suspected that in many cases the data used both on publications and on grants was incomplete. So UCU did an excellent job of discrediting these criteria by arguing that, first of all, the use of REF units of assessment for this purpose was counter to the REF code of practice, and pointing out, with the help from some various people who are in this meeting. Yeah? Hello? Somebody had the mic, somebody said something. Okay, I'm pointing out that field-weighted citation index was not a stable metric for the assessment of individuals. In May, the university came back with a new set of criteria. Staff were now selected for falling below a grant income threshold based on their HESA code, and on the basis of a new seemingly ad hoc assessment by the senior management team, which they were calling a rounded qualitative assessment. And this process selected a subset of 32 people from the original 47 members of staff. UCU have contested whether this assessment was rounded and qualitative. And indeed, they've suggested the question whether this process could actually have taken place as claimed. I won't summarize these articles now, but in the link that Dave gave, there's a very long description, a very long critique of that. Okay, so having brought you all up to date on that, I'll hand over to the speakers. So what we're going to do is hear from all the speakers, and then we'll all speak for about 5 minutes, and then at the end we'll ask them all questions and have a panel discussion. If you have any questions as we move through, please put them in the chat, and I'll pick them out and create and make sure as many of them as possible are addressed. So as our first speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Luna Centofanti. So Luna is a senior lecturer and senior research tutor in the Department of Primary Care and Mental Health at the University of Liverpool. So over to you, Luna.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to give a quite passionate talk because I'm one of the 32 people now up for redundancy. I've got my earrings of rise up, fight back this evening, and thanks for having me on, Colin. So the title intrigued me because it's the metric tide, but I don't really feel like it's been a tide. I feel like it's been more accurate to say there's been a sewer of metrics since the beginning of at least the time that I've been in academia. So I grew up in the US education system where pretty much grades and your grade point average don't matter as much as the SAT or the graduate record examination, the GRE. So especially as a person who's Latina and from Puerto Rico, it was really difficult for me to get through the systems in the US. I took the SAT actually while I was pregnant. I took the GRE while I was soaking wet because I was able to get a fee waiver for it by being randomly assigned to a location in the US, which ended up being the middle of Manhattan, and it was raining and I didn't have an umbrella. So because of my GRE scores, I was blocked out of getting into PhD programs for years, despite having a 3.95 GPA, having stellar references, years of voluntary public service, leadership and teaching, conference presentations, even as an undergrad. And there was bias in these matrices, to keep the social order and the status quo. You could tell that these metrics were not fair and were not equal. So that was my first dealing with metrics. But of course, research metrics in the UK have been on people's lips for years. We had a ballot in Liverpool over the use of ref metrics within our university. And, to be honest, that's why I was lured to come to the UK, was because of my papers. I had 8 papers coming out of my PhD and postdoc, and I was brought to the UK really for the ref. Or the RAE at the time. And then I was lured to Liverpool in 2016. I was headhunted to come to University of Liverpool. I was working at University of Durham. And I was brought in late 2016. And now I received notice that I am in the scope of redundancy barely out of 2020. So right when they're submitting the January 2021 ref. And then, as Colin said, in this redundancy exercise, it's not a true redundancy, but, the metrics that they used were things like the FWCI, or Field Weighted Citation Index. I was playing a game. I was told to play a game of publishing in high impact papers, right? So psychiatry, because I'm in psychology, psychiatry would be more high impact. So go for that, Luna. Well, then when the FWCI and SciVal were ranking where my paper should go, I turned up in a lot of, immunology. The journals were ranked in immunology and, psychiatry. And of course, I'm going to be ranked against people in that area, which I thought was completely unfair. So one level of game playing led me into the jaws of another level of game playing of the FWCI. And now we learn, in taking down the 47 down to 32, we learn that deans and other faculty executives have read and ranked our papers to tell if they're world leading. Now, this was people who were already identified in the 47. That didn't change in terms, no one new came into scope in the 32. They were from the original 47. So excuse me while I try to understand how an executive, pro-vice chancellor, or a dean of institute or associate pro-vice chancellor in the faculty is going to look at my papers with any kind of equal judgment when we know about confirmation bias as psychologists. Also, my grants were benchmarked based on HESA cost centers in terms of mean levels based on the last 5 years. And recently, my line manager said I was categorized in clinical medicine. So I was expected to bring in £180,000 per year for the last 5 years. If I were ranked in psychology, where I think I should be, it would be 5 times less that amount of money. But then I checked the system under which all staff are listed, and I was listed as being within anatomy and physiology. So I feel like, does my employer even know me at all? I feel like I'm in a Terry Gilliam's Brazil movie right now. And we know that these redundancies are illegal. We weren't told any of these, about these metrics when we were hired. If I'm ranked over the last 5 years, I should have at least been told that these grant income benchmarks were going to be used when I was hired, since it was 4.5 years ago, or at least at my first PDR. But all of my PDRs have been great. I've been told that my research publications are, have been ranked as 4-star by University of York, one of them. My promotion panel in 2018 told me my research papers were good. So it's not a real redundancy either in terms of reducing the, what they're offering in teaching. So I teach on the doctorate in clinical psychology. We took in more trainees last year to become clinical psychologists because there's an employment shortage of clinical psychologists in the UK. We took 25% more trainees last year, hired no new staff. And this year we were offered 25% more. We just hired someone 4 weeks ago, not even, into our department. So how can it be a real redundancy when we just hired someone? Still, I'm racking my brain on what I could have done to save my job if they're saying, oh, well, Luna, you didn't bring £187,000 a year. What could I have done differently? What could I have left behind in order to meet these targets? Well, I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't have created an award-winning teaching workshop, which was given an award, teaching award 2 years ago. Maybe I shouldn't have published over 30 papers in the time that I've been at University of Liverpool. I shouldn't have supervised to completion and qualification a dozen clinical doctoral trainees and helped them to publish and present at conferences. I should not have covered for posts that were left vacant for 3 years in my area. I shouldn't have offered consultancy for prevention of school exclusion for boys in Liverpool. Definitely should not have co-created a health postgraduate teaching program for mental health nurses. Shouldn't have led in Athena Swan and gotten us the Silver Award, which opened up opportunities to apply for NIHR funds in that time. Shouldn't have mentored first generation students to publish, present at academic conferences. One of them got into a clinical doctorate program in London. Definitely shouldn't have helped her. Shouldn't have mentored a student to get into a PhD program. She now has a Lancet paper and a postdoc offer at Bangor and really appreciates all my help, thought I was an inspiration, but I should have instead focused on grants. And I definitely shouldn't have offered my expertise to chair a steering group to improve the lives, opportunities, literacy, and mental health of kids and families in the North Birkenhead region and Wirral, because it only places my hand on the expenditure of £4 million in that region to help health inequalities. And so I feel like, what is a university for? People talk about what a university is for and the effects on research integrity, but hardly anyone talks about equality, diversity, and inclusion. We know that Blacks and people like me, Caribbean people, are less likely to get grants. We know women are less likely, and obviously those intersections matter. So if we select people just on grant income, we'll end up with a bunch of white males, I feel. So it speaks to the inherent racism within the exercise of weaponizing metrics and using rank and yank based on income. And I feel like this will result in worse research and more discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luna, for a great summary of what's going on and what's happening to many people across the faculty. As I said, if anyone has any questions for Luna, if anyone else as we go along, please put them in the chat, and I'm watching it constantly and we'll pick them out. So our next speaker, we have James Wilsden. So James is Professor of Research Policy at the University of Sheffield, and was the chair of the government inquiry, the Metrics Tide, from which we stole our event name.
Thank you, Colin, very much. And yeah, I don't know if it's a pleasure to be here under these circumstances, but it's good to be here to express solidarity with colleagues at Liverpool who have found themselves at the centre of this particular storm, and also to hopefully join the dots between this episode and other debates that are running and raging across the higher education research system in the UK and elsewhere. So I'm here, as Colin says. I mean, with Stephen Curry, who you're going to hear from shortly, and others, I produced this review in 2015 called The Metric Tide, which was an attempt to answer a question that was set to us by the then Minister for Science and Universities, David Willits, who wanted to know whether he could switch off the peer review system that ran behind the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, and replace it with a purely metrics-based assessment exercise. So we took the question quite seriously, spent a lot of time looking at this, drew heavily on related initiatives elsewhere in the world, including the Leiden Manifesto and DORA, what you're going to hear from representatives from both of those very shortly. And we came back to the minister and we said, well, no, you can't really do that, because if you do, it may solve one or two problems over here, but you'll create a whole new set of problems in doing so. And particularly we were worried that in moving hastily and completely in that direction, you would, the government and the funding councils would suppress very important features of the research system that we all value very greatly in terms of its diversity, its plurality, the range of different pathways that people can take through research, which, as we've already heard from Luna, are under pressure in all sorts of ways as it is, but would be made even more so if something like the REF was purely metrics based. So this was it was a I guess not the argument necessarily that the government wanted to hear when it was given back to them, but to their credit, they did listen to that argument and subsequent arguments that were made by Nick Stern in a review of the REF, and they decided for the REF that we've just gone through to maintain peer review by panel as the primary means of assessment. I'm sure there are lots of things about the REF that we would all on this call and elsewhere like to see reformed and improved, and I'm not defending the totality of the exercise, but I do think if it's some small comfort, it could have been worse had it not been for those arguments. So, it's in that context, and I should say subsequently following that review in the UK, we saw the creation of this Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, which brings together the funders, universities and others to look at these issues in an ongoing way. And I continue to be a member of that group. And it's in this context that we were very concerned when we heard these reports coming from colleagues in Liverpool about what seemed on the face of it to be a sort of gratuitous example of irresponsible metrics use in the use particularly of the two indicators that were mentioned, the field-weighted citation indicator and a research income indicator. And the application of those in ways that seemed, at very least, deeply problematic in terms of the process. In the metric tide, we tried to distill a lot of the wisdom that has accumulated on these topics over recent years into 5 simple principles. I mean, these were themselves a compression of points in Dora and Leiden, so colleagues will forgive me for rolling them out now, and they'll be repeated probably at more length by others, but to mention our 5, because I think they all have, or at least 4 of them at least have definite relevance to this specific case. Our first was an argument that metrics need to be robust in terms of their selection and application, and I think, as we've seen here, particularly the FWCI indicator was never designed nor intended to be applied in this way at the level of individuals. So we see from the off a misplaced concreteness in the application of an indicator like that in this kind of way. I don't know whether that was by design or by sort of ignorance, as it were, by those who decided to use it, but it's not appropriate, and it's good to see that there has been at least some movement on that front, even if not as much as one might like to see. So robustness was the first. The second principle we outlined was humility, and by that we were trying to argue that while of course some quantitative indicators have their place, they need to be understood and kept in context as, in a sense, subservient to a richer, more rounded, more qualitative assessment, particularly again at the level of individuals, simply because, as we've already heard and as has been at the heart of this case, you can't capture the richness of individuals' contributions to the university, to the research system, by a reductionist small number of indicators. So humility was very important. And again, I mean, I don't know if we've seen enough humility in this particular instance. The third, which I think is really critical here, is the principle of transparency, by which we mean that data collection and the analytical processes that accompany that data collection need to remain open and transparent, particularly so those who are being assessed can firstly understand the indicators that are being used to measure their performance, but very importantly can also test and verify the results. So there needs to be the capacity for people to do that, and I think that's been patently absent in this case, as I've seen it reported and had it explained to me. And I think even the move to things like HESA subject codes is hugely problematic, because how many of us here on this call as academics even know what HESA code we sit under? I certainly have absolutely no idea. So the idea that you could be judged, on your performance relative to a categorization that you have no prior understanding of seems to me thoroughly in opposition to this important principle of transparency. And a fourth, I'll only mention the 4 of the 5, is that of diversity. That continually what we see as the biggest problem with a reliance on a very small, narrow set of indicators, whether that's journal impact factors or in this case, field weighted citation indicators. The problem with using a very small set of indicators is that you, in doing so, choke off and shut out a lot of the richness and range of activities that people are actually engaged in. And, at a time when we're actually trying to encourage in other contexts researchers to contribute in all sorts of other ways to their own university, to society at large, it seems thoroughly perverse and self-defeating to then try and use a very narrow set of indicators to assess people. So for all of these reasons, I personally, and I think many of my colleagues on the Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, were quite concerned by this case. It seemed to us an unusual instance where these measures were being used in this very visible way as the basis of redundancy processes, which isn't, in our view, the kind of direction that these debates should be moving in. We've seen, in fact, quite the opposite over recent years. I'm sure Stephen and others will reinforce this in the UK and elsewhere, a very welcome surge of positive and proactive engagement with more responsible approaches through signing of DORA and other things. And that move to more responsible modes of metric usage and of research assessment is something that I and others have welcomed and seen as very positive, but it is a very fragile movement, and it's easy to see how it can be pushed back, and it only takes a few universities or a few funders or others to sort of push back on this for it to sort of start to unravel. So for that reason and many others, I won't go over my time. I say I'm pleased to be here and wish to express our solidarity and support for colleagues at Liverpool in their efforts to try and address the specifics of this case, but also I think quite rightly to draw links and build arguments from this specific case to other potential cases elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. So just conscious of time, so I'll move on quickly. If anyone has any questions for James, please again put them in the chat and you have a chance to ask them later. So our next speaker is Dorothy Bishop. So Dorothy is Professor of Developmental Neuropsychology at the University of Oxford. However, she's speaking to us in a personal capacity today, as she's become a prominent voice on matters of research assessment and its impact on scientific practice, primarily through her blogging and appearance in the media. So Dorothy has actually pre-recorded a talk because she had a few problems with Zoom recently, so I'm going to play her talk. She is in the meeting, but to avoid issues, to avoid problems, I said I'd play the recording. I should explain that Dorothy's talk is a little over 5 minutes in length. This is entirely my fault, as I told her we were aiming for 10 minutes when we had fewer speakers and forgot to and failed to then correct that error. So I will play the recording right away.
Well, many thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm here in a capacity of just representing myself, not any institution. But I guess I was invited because I have blogged over many years on things like research evaluation, and I have particular views on the use of grant income as a way of evaluating researchers, which I'll briefly tell you about now. I can see the attraction of using grant income, which many institutions do, in the sense that it's objective and it's also, of course, relevant for academics. But what I'm going to do is to argue that there are 6 reasons why, in practice, it's very bad and not fair and has unintended consequences. The first reason it's, I think, not a good proxy is that these days, in the 21st century, in most academic disciplines, research is done by teams rather than by a lone genius. In the past, it may have been true that great discoveries were made by a single individual, perhaps with a research assistant. But these days, most research will be done by groups of people who will have different sorts of skills, all of which are necessary to the research, but not all of which involve getting grants. So you may need people to do all sorts of different things, such as coding or have technical skills and so on. And those people are just as necessary for research to be successful as the person who writes the grant. And so if you pluck out the people who are not getting grants and discard them, you could actually end up with a research group that is thoroughly dysfunctional. So you need to be thinking about the bigger picture than the individual researcher. The same sort of argument applies at a broader level to whole departments. So departments typically need to have people who can do teaching, who can do outreach, who can do things like the Athena Swan application, which is a huge amount of work, as much work as writing a grant proposal. And these are just some examples of things that need to be done. And somehow universities try and maintain the myth that everybody can be wonderful at all these things. That's just ridiculous. In practice, some people are better at some things than others, and you need this balance of roles and skills in university departments with people finding their niche in which they can thrive. So again, if you have a department that is all focused on one thing, you can end up very unbalanced and with some areas not adequately covered. The third reason comes very much from my observations serving on grant panels, and that is that chance plays a large role in grant success. It's well known that there's very poor agreement between different people rating grants. And this is perhaps not surprising because there's so many different, a grant is really a fairly multidimensional thing. It can be good and bad in so many different ways. There's so many different aspects. Some people value some things more than others. And typically you're comparing grants that may be in quite different subject areas. So it can be quite hard to really compare these apples and oranges with one another. And certainly my experience is that most funders will have a large number of entirely fundable grants between which they have to choose, and there can be a degree of arbitrariness at the end of the day in terms of who gets funded. And it may just depend on who happens to be on the grant panel, who happens to be asked to review that grant, and just the luck of the draw. So if you're treating grant success as an evidence of academic excellence, you're really measuring people not just on how good they are, but also on how lucky they are. And that is likely to be pretty demoralizing for people and not a very fair way of evaluating people. In addition, grant income is an input measure. It's how much you get income to do research, but what about bang for your buck? Are we going to say that we don't value somebody who actually generates a lot of good research without requiring a lot of financial resources? That would actually mean that a lot of people who historically have been regarded as very good researchers or even Nobel laureates might not be fundable in the current system. And indeed, Nobel laureates of the past are fond of telling people that they would not have survived the REF, for example. So you really need to think more about what are people doing with the resources they get, rather than just treating the getting of resources as an end in itself. The focus on grant income can also encourage what I call grant hoarding. You get these people who can be like captains of industry in an academic sort of way and get grant after grant, and the bigger the better. And I think we've probably all seen examples of that, and I think it's not healthy. In part because for a grant to be really successful, it needs concentrated attention from people with skills and experience doing the research. And I've certainly come across early career researchers who complain that the PI is never there because they're so busy doing too many different things. They really haven't got much an idea of what's going on because they've delegated everything. And I think that's actually something that hasn't been looked at hard enough, how far you can actually have too much grant income. I mean, that for many university administrators, that would seem a joke to say that you can have too much. But I would argue it has a corrosive effect on research. It dilutes the quality of research, and it can end up meaning that there's not enough money to go around, but the money that there is not being used wisely. And so there's a lot of waste. Finally, the psychological element. academics need mental space to do good research. If you keep them anxious because they keep thinking that if they don't get the next grant, they might be out of a job, this takes up a lot of mental space. You really need to have a sense of relaxation and ability.
Mental space too.
Very short term, and in the next round they might be gone for not getting that grant. It actually will damage their productivity on any grant that they've currently got if they're worrying about these sorts of things. Now, having said all that, I have some sympathy for university administrators who have to always, the phrase that's always used is we have to make difficult decisions, but they do. We live in the real world. Things don't stand still, so we can't just keep everything going as it always has done. There may be things that do need to change. There may at times be redundancies need to be made if there's just, the institution has to make ends meet in difficult times with a lot of external pressures. So decisions have to be made. We can't just say, oh, this is a bad criterion and therefore let's get rid of it. You have to put something in its place. Fortunately, I don't have to be responsible for telling you about that because there's other speakers in this session who are going to have many positive suggestions for alternative and much less destructive approaches to evaluation. And in particular, I'm aware of the Live Manifesto and the Hong Kong Principles, to name just two. But the bottom line for institutions, I would argue, is that people who run institutions should be asking themselves, suppose the Times Higher, instead of focusing on rankings for grant income, rankings for publications, rankings for student satisfaction, and rankings for staff satisfaction. What would your institution look like if that was the case? If the answer is that you do badly, then you're really not making good use of your most precious resource, which is your staff. Because without your staff, you really can't function. And you want happy, contented staff who will then repay you in full if they feel valued and fostered. What you are doing is creating incentives for poor quality research. As I've already said, I think you're really making people feel that they have to continually be putting in grant proposals rather than taking time to focus on perhaps one aspect of research very carefully. But you're not just damaging research and your staff, you're also damaging yourself because you're damaging your reputation once it gets out that people are very unhappy in your institution and that you're adopting rather arbitrary and unfair criteria for evaluating people. And that's going to deter excellent staff from coming to work at your institution. So you're really going to get into a negative spiral if you're not careful. And therefore, my advice is very strongly, let's get rid of grant income as a means of evaluating people. But to hear about other things we might do, I will stop now and allow you to hear the other speakers.
Thank you very much indeed, Dorothy. That was a great talk. Sorry, I stopped the video at one point to cough and I didn't realize I was muting myself. I didn't realize I was muting Dorothy as well. So thanks. If you have any questions for Dorothy, then please, again, put them in the chat. So moving to the next speaker, which is David Mower, who is just sharing his screen here. Sorry, that confused me for some reason. So David is an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa, and he's also lead author of the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Researchers that Dorothy just mentioned. And it's in that capacity that he's talking to us today. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Colin. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and show solidarity and support for the folks at Liverpool who are obviously dealing with a very difficult situation. I wanted to really spend a few minutes talking about the Hong Kong Principles. It was our effort to really sort of focus on research integrity as it relates to assessing researchers. This was pulled together at the World Conference of Research Integrity. Although we are the authors, we had input from about 100 people, 100 experts in different fields. And I do want to support Luna's perspective that research integrity needs to include EDI. And the Hong Kong principles will be focusing on the EDI of research integrity from next year at the Cape Town meeting of the World Congress of Research Integrity. Like the metric tide, we came up with 5 principles for assessing researchers. I'm going to just focus on one today, but my overall comment is that throughout these principles, and I think James has sort of mentioned this already, is the notion of transparency in whatever one is doing for research assessment is just essential. It has to be something that is deeply respected and ingrained in the process. And I think the question that I would ask is the Liverpool process transparent? And perhaps for me, it could be a lot more transparent. And the 5th principle we look at is really to recognize essential other tasks, such as peer review and mentoring. And so, it's probably a little bit bigger than that. So, our people or researchers within Liverpool, are they assessed in any way on engagement with the community? I mean, that's sort of maybe part of our societal responsibilities. We don't just live in our university, but our university is part of a community as well. And so what is the faculty, the staff, what are they doing to engage the community? What is the faculty and staff doing to engage in dissemination of knowledge? Peer review and editorial responsibilities, either being an editor-in-chief or having some other editorial responsibilities, is essential if one is going to engage in measuring researcher assessment. Engagement with future leaders. I mean, do we want leaders that we can provide mentorship for? And I know that Luna gave some lovely examples of that effort, and that's really so important. And the question is, in a sense, from a broad perspective, including research integrity, why aren't we looking at these elements when we're assessing researchers? And something that really has, I suppose, in some sense, enraged me that I've seen in the plague is this whole notion of data sharing. And it's by no means limited to biomedicine. If we look, for example, at the Wellcome Trust, who came out early in 2020, really asking researchers and other stakeholders in the ecosystem to share their data and to make any research available in an open access environment. And from an early look, what can we see? We can see about 1 in 5 people had any data availability statement, and perhaps 1 in 10 made their data available. I mean, it's really quite useless in a public health emergency that people are not sharing their data. And why would we simply focus on counting publications? Publications are of very limited use if the data is not shared. And so, for example, if we look at all of the vaccine trials, none of the data is shared. And so there are some inherent problems there. And I'm going to stop sharing and sort of close my, my presentation.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. Encourage people to all go away and read that, to read the principles in full. It's a shame we have so many talk speakers, great speakers. We don't get to hear more about more from each of them. But okay, so my next speaker, I'm going to hand over to Ludo Waltman. So Ludo is Professor of Quantitative Social Sciences at Leiden University. He's also one of the authors of the other thing that Dorothy mentioned, which is the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. So I think that's what he's going to tell us a little about today.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, I would like to start by first thanking Luna for sharing the impressive story of this situation that you're in, Luna. It's really sad, of course, and I'm very sorry to hear that about this situation that clearly is unfair. I would like to give a little bit of background on kind of what I'm doing to kind of make clear how I'm myself positioned in all these discussions. So I'm a deputy director of the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. So we are a research center that is studying the science system. What we also do is a lot of work in the area of bibliometrics. We are actually a research center that is creating lots of research metrics. Also, my own research group is playing an important role in that. So we have a lot of experience in this area, especially metrics based on publications, citations. We have done lots of work on this. We produce these metrics. We also reflect on these metrics. We reflect on what they do and do not tell us, how they can be used and how they should not be used or should not be interpreted. So metrics like, for instance, this FWCI, the Elsevier metric, that's something that's something where actually I also made contributions to all the kind of work behind a metric like that. So I know in a lot of detail how these metrics work. And I believe actually they have value in certain very specific contexts, but I also believe it's entirely clear beyond any doubt that in the situation that we are discussing today, it doesn't make any sense to rely on such a metric. It's very, very problematic because the metric cannot provide meaningful information in this specific setting. So what we have done in Leiden is we have produced the so-called Leiden Manifesto, and I will put it in the chat. So that's a statement that we published a number of years ago, where we try to kind of summarize our position on these debates about metrics, where on the one hand we want to make clear that we feel there's value in metrics for specific purposes in specific situations, but at the same time we also want to express our deep concerns about misuse of metrics, which in our view at that time, but that still applies also today, is widespread. And in a more kind of constructive way, we try in this manifesto, we try to provide principles that could provide guidance for responsible use of metrics. So we have 10 principles. I won't go through them, but they essentially are similar to what James mentioned when he summarized the 5 metric type principles. One of these principles makes clear that the level of individual researchers, so the use of metrics at this specific level, is something where we need to be extremely cautious. I don't want to say that metrics are completely useless at that level, but if you use them, they need to be embedded within processes of evaluation where the full range of activities of a researcher is properly taken into account, a holistic perspective on the things people are doing. Metrics might perhaps play a small role in that, but they should definitely not be the dominant element in making decisions about people. And that applies, of course, even more in the case of redundancies. So this is basically where I kind of the background I have, and also the work I've done in this area. There's a lot that can be said about specific metrics, and I think we just heard a very clear argument against the use of research income. But perhaps it doesn't matter so much in the end. FWCI, research income, any metric, even if we all put a lot of effort into trying to make it as accurate and as fair as possible, any metric will be problematic for this specific purpose if we rely on one single metric for making these types of decisions. So we should not do that. We should really not make use of metrics in this specific way. It's unfair at the level of individual people. Luna's story made that clear, very clear. But you could say even at a more fundamental level, it's going to create a culture in our institutions that is really counterproductive, and that will in the end lead to universities providing outputs that in the end do not really serve society, do not really help us to make progress, to improve things. The diversity argument that was already mentioned a number of times. So there are lots of reasons why we should not do this, and that's where I would like to end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Lulu. So again, any questions for Lulu, put them in the chat. So our final speaker is Stephen Curry. Stephen is Professor in the Department of Life Sciences at Imperial College London, and he's also Chair of the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. So I'll hand over to Stephen now.
Thank you, Colin. I'm very mindful of the time and of my ability to waffle on, so please gesticulate wildly as soon as I get to 5 minutes. But thank you for the opportunity to be present at this meeting and to talk to you. I'm here to tell you about DORA, but also to listen and to learn, because where we are today is really at the coalface of research assessment. It's where all the theory and all the high ideals grinds into the hard surface of reality. So let me just very briefly sort of introduce you to DORA. And DORA is actually two things in my mind anyway. So first of all, it's a declaration. That's what the acronym stands for, Declaration on Research Assessment. And it was published in 2013. And as such, it's in a sense a prisoner of history, as all declarations are. It was written by a bunch of editors of scholarly journals. And it was very much squarely aimed at, the issue of research assessment, but particularly took aim at the journal impact factor and the particular misuse of that metric in terms of research assessment. So there was a broad aim to improve research assessment. But if you read the declaration, and I would encourage everyone to do so, you'll see that it's very much focused on outputs. And thinking more broadly about outputs and contributions when it comes to research assessment, which I think is a theme that all the speakers, I think, have shared. So, for example, just to be clear about it, so there are, in addition to the sort of primary recommendation not to use the impact factor as a surrogate for the quality of research, for institutions, there is a provision to be explicit about the criteria used to reach hiring, tenure, and promotion decisions, clearly highlighting, especially for early stage investigators, that the scientific content, and the DORA is very much comes from the scientific community, of a paper is much more important than publication metrics or the identity of the journal in which it was published. And for the purposes of research assessment, consider the value and impact of all research outputs, including data sets and software, in addition to research publications, and consider a broad range of impact measures, including qualitative indicators of research impact, such as influence on policy and practice. So, those are the sort of key provisions for a university in thinking about its implementing its commitment to DORA. But it's important to bear in mind a little bit, as Ludo says, DORA does not rule out metrics altogether. It's really very much about understanding their limitations and using them in context and using them sensibly. So the second thing that DORA is it's an organization. And we have sort of three main aims, which are to promote the declaration, to expand the geographical and disciplinary reach of the initiative, because it very much started off in the United States and very much focused on cell and molecular biology, and to develop and promote good practice around research assessment. So we've been very much part, as James mentioned earlier, of a much larger movement and discussion, which is taking a deep look at research culture. And in that process, I think DORA has been a very influential player and continues to be influential in that endeavor. And in doing so, we are very much, we work with the wider community and with different stakeholders in order to foster good practice. And that means working with funders, with universities, and with publishers as well. And we will provide, when requested, guidance on implementation. Okay, but one thing that's really important to make clear is that we are not a regulator of research assessment across the world. And we're not a regulator because we are a very small organization. We have 1.2 members of staff, okay, to do all the work that DORA does. Everybody else who's a member of our steering group and our advisory boards give their time voluntarily. And so we're not in a position to go around the world and police compliance with the declaration by organizations. What we do is that when information comes into the public domain, that evidence of concern that an organization may not be adhering to the spirit of the declaration that they've signed up to, then we will contact them. Okay, we did that in the case of Liverpool. Such contacts we undertake confidentially. This is not the first time that we've had to speak to an organization, and I'm sure it's not the last time, because implementing DORA is in and of itself a complex task. Now, so we did contact Liverpool University. I spoke to the faculty dean. I also spoke to David White of the UCU. So of all the external participants here, I think I'm maybe the only one who's spoken to both parties involved in the dispute that is going on. I'm not going to give chapter and verse as to what that conversation undertook, but it was a free and frank conversation, and that's what the confidentiality allows us to do. And it did, I think, along with pressure from other organizations, I think also the Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, led to the dropping of the use of or the misuse, shall we say, as Ludo has explained, of the field weighted citation index, and to, I think, a clearer articulation that, qualitative aspects of people's different contributions to the faculty, to the department, are part of the assessment. Now, we had very powerful testimony from Luna about her very particular experiences of that process. I'm not going to comment on the details of that. It is not, it's not in my gift to be the investigator or the adjudicator of, who said what or who is absolutely doing what. I do appreciate that these are very difficult times, and I do take James's point that although there has been, I think even particularly in the UK, a strong uptake of DORA, it is really, it's yet to be seen how exactly that plays out from institution to institution. It's a non-trivial undertaking. I think many are doing so in good faith, but there are difficulties along the way. And certainly I've seen that even at my own institution. It is a struggle sometimes with some individuals to get them to accept the importance of shifting the conversation on culture to really looking in the round at people's contributions. So I'm going to leave my remarks there. I'm very happy to try and take questions about that. I can only really stay till about 6 o'clock, but I can maybe push that to 10 past if there are particular questions, because I know, and I do want to hear from people because these interactions very much help DORA to do its job properly.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So we have a few questions that's in the chat so I'll just go straight to the questions for you then, since you need to leave. So Levi asks, so it's very appreciative of each speaker coming and sharing today. Quick question for Professor Curry. Given that UOL is a signatory of DORA, the university has stated and publicized receiving written confirmation from DORA and possibly the chair of the DORA steering committee, Professor Stephen Curry, that their approach to the redundancy imposed under Project SHAPE is fully compliant with DORA recommendations. Is this accurate? And is DORA willing to share the letter/written correspondence with staff?
Okay, right. Thank you, Levi, for the question. So I did receive a request. I received a letter outlining the revised process that Liverpool was using and asking me whether or not that was compliant with DORA. I didn't understand at the time that they would share the correspondence publicly. Since they have done, let me give you a sort of an excerpt of what I wrote back. I wrote, the key paragraph really is, I'm pleased to learn that as a result of conversations with DORA and others, the university has discontinued the use of the field-weighted citation impact in assessing staff and instituted a process that is centered on qualitative evaluation of the range, content, and quality of their contributions. This is in keeping with the approach to research assessment advocated by DORA. Those are the words that I used. Now, they have paraphrased what I said, but I'm be happy to share that text since it's been made public in a different form.
Thank you.
Now, well, sorry, maybe Levi wants to come back.
Yeah, do you want to come back on that, Levi, or shall I move on to another question?
No, I think we can. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I was just querying too, because I think I saw some other questions in the chat that are related to that. The degree to which the University of Liverpool was adhering to all the different recommendations of DORA, some of which are also related to being transparent and explicitly sharing the criteria against which different staff are being measured against. So I think we can, I very much appreciate you sharing that, Prof. Curry, as well. And that addresses my question, but I think, Colin, if you want to move, I saw some of the similar questions I had in the chat, maybe just move on to those.
So yes, I missed one above you. So Robert Knox says, since the members of staff targeted for redundancy at Liverpool have been targeted based on criteria they did not know about in advance and data they did not see, surely this lack of transparency is not compatible with DORA point 4 that you just mentioned.
Okay. I think there's potentially a point there, and one that's worth exploring. One is, I mean, I often get asked by universities about this or that point of or paragraph in the DORA declaration, and I sometimes feel I'm being made to be a theologian and trying to interpret ancient scripts for the modern world. And transparency is important, but you know, the DORA declaration is largely fixated on research outputs, and so I don't think it would be fair to fall back on a technicality and say, well, it doesn't mention research input, okay, in research assessment. Clearly, that is part of it, but I think a lot of it depends on, you know, what you mean by transparency in a way. I mean, it would be my view personally that anyone who's recruited as an academic in the UK in the past 25 years or more would understand that part of the job is to initiate and maintain a research program, and that there would be an expectation, notwithstanding, you know, the points that Dorothy made, which is quite right, that, you know, fixation on, you know, on research funding can be unhealthy. I think it would be relatively widely understood that keeping your research going is part of the job. Now, one can quibble about the degree of transparency or the degree of clarity that is required, but it would be my understanding, of having worked in the UK myself for that period of time, that would be a commonly understood expectation.
Robert, do you want to come back on that?
I mean, I would come back just very briefly to say that seems to me to be a very wide understanding of transparency, which would seem to render it almost somewhat moot. If people are given specific expectations at one point and they change, that seems to me to not be in keeping with that. I mean, I feel like on at least the reading that you just had there, would that have any bite? Does DORA have any bite on that kind of reading?
Well, I appreciate people will have different views on what that means. I mean, clearly, I mean, the grant income threshold is obviously one that is troublesome to UCU. The whole process is one where there are other factors which are taken as mitigation. So it's not as if it's an all or nothing decision based on whether or not you meet a level of grant income threshold. So there are other factors there which are based on other contributions and a qualitative assessment of people's contributions. But I'm not, you know, I'm not here to defend or to promote the university's perspective on this. I'm here giving my personal perspective and my perspective as the chair of DORA.
Okay, we have a couple of people with hands up. I'll bring in David if that's okay first.
Yeah, I mean, it was more a point of clarification. I appreciate Stephen probably feeling a bit like he's on the rack here because the questions are directed to him, because because you're going in 8 minutes, I'm afraid, Stephen. But I just wanted to look a couple of points of information because, first of all, I mean, it's kind of a question because we, you know, and I'm not talking on behalf of UCU here. I'm talking on behalf of the staff, actually, and the staff who are affected by this. Nobody could believe when they saw the qualitative criteria that they were being described as qualitative criteria, because one of them refers to research income. One of them is based on reading of papers, fair enough, but in a time frame and using a method that could not possibly have been done. And one of them refers to 80% of teaching. So if you, which is your normal expectation is 40%. So these seem to be set at very, very high. This is not a way of qualitatively assessing someone's research performance in the way that Luna and David particularly and Dorothy outlined. It's just not a way of, it's not a rounded assessment. It's picking a few things to say we've done a rounded assessment, bish bash bong, there you go. And that's the problem I think that faces not just Dora but everyone, because if you just say, well, that's a you know, a rounded assessment, then you know, where are we going here apart from this being slapdash? And of course, this gets completely exploited. Not one single person in the original 47 was removed as a result of that rounded quantitative assessment. Not one single person, and that speaks volumes. So I think we're going to have to come back to this because I think also we would want to kind of engage in this dialogue because honestly, Dora does not look particularly clever if this is regarded, you know, and in terms of the letter that was sent, the university is shouting for the rafters about how Dora approves this and that, and approves exactly what I've said, which is just a nonsense of a rounded assessment. And so I think that's quite important from our perspective. But as I say, I don't want to put you on the rack. I just think that Dora cannot be led down the garden path here, and obviously we're going to make all of this public.
Okay, well, so you've shared information with me there that I didn't have beforehand. So the numbers that you shared, the information that was given to me is basically the same as what was published on the Liverpool's website about the business case and the revised criteria. So it was that level of detail that I was given. But, you know, again, I come back to, you know, we are a very small operation. I'm doing this in my free time, and we simply don't have the capacity. I appreciate people might want us to come in and provide and do a thorough investigation and provide an adjudication, but we do not have the resources to do that. We work and we assume good faith on behalf of all the participants that we deal with, because we're very much part of a broader community effort.
So can I just come in on that point? I recognize that you can't be brought in to arbitrate on these issues, but effectively you have, right? Because the University of Liverpool are using you. They're saying this. They're basically saying rubber stamped by Dora. They're saying this is approved. This is a Dora approved set of redundancies. So I recognize that you can't be brought in. You know, I recognize you can't be expected to do that. But that's essentially what's happening here. It's got the Dora brand on this, and does that concern you or?
I was a little bit concerned that, you know, the information was shared. I thought it was a private correspondence. But then for that reason, then I've shared the text that you have, and I'll send you that text if you wish. But I guess we are vulnerable to being played by either side.
Sure.
And I know that people are looking for clarity and a decision, but you know, Dora simply is not in the position to provide that. We don't have the resources, and it would set a precedent that would basically wipe us out, because everybody would be coming to us to adjudicate on this or that disagreement.
So I understand that 100%. So then would you be so you have been, in this case, you have been brought in to adjudicate. So given that you don't wish to serve as an adjudicator, would you be willing, I mean, would you,
No,
would you
we
willing to
haven't
say that you don't?
We haven't adjudicated. We have given an opinion based on information provided. We're not making a determination.
But the University of Liverpool is presenting the information that you have made an adjudication. So it would seem important to counter that.
We're welcome to dispute that.
We are welcome to dispute that. Is that, sorry, did I catch that correctly? We're welcome to dispute that DORA has.
That is your right. You can dispute it if you wish.
What dispute that they've been given the, I mean, I'm not in a position to dispute it. You're the only person here in a position to dispute it. Have they or have they not been given?
I've given an opinion based on the information that I was provided with, which is essentially the information that's on Liverpool's website. And, you know, I have assumed that they are acting in good faith, and I have given an opinion based on that assumption.
Okay, I'm going to bring in James here, if that's okay.
Sorry,
bring in Anthony, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you, Stephen, for coming, by the way. You know, we are very grateful. I just wanted to ask a question on this because you are dead right that DORA is not a regulator. And nobody here would expect DORA to have a regulatory kind of body, you know, given the lack of resource and given the various things that you've pointed out. But there is a clear fundamental problem here in that kind of a university is attempting to use DORA as an excuse to threaten employment status of people, saying this is complicit with DORA. And now I don't suspect for 1 minute anyone involved in the work of DORA, involved in any kind of forum for responsible research metrics ever intended for that to threaten employment status and bring those kinds of, you know, positions to bear. And you made a very interesting point earlier, a very valid point that, you know, researchers would expect to have certain expectations around producing research. Now, the university has specific role profiles and role expectations that talk about internationally excellent research, and UCU and others might dispute that, but they've never talked about world-leading research. And now this qualitative assessment is talking about world-leading research to prevent you from being made redundant, that if you aren't responsible for producing world-leading research, your employment status is at risk and your livelihood is at risk as a consequence. And I think this is kind of the crux of this, really. The moment, and I have every sympathy with you in this, and I genuinely do, because this isn't of your making. But the moment an employer begins to look at these kinds of elements of responsible metrics and tries to launder their reputation through that, and tries to say they are in compliance with that, to threaten the livelihood and employment status, that is where it gets problematic if DORA's name comes to it. You know, our members know about their role profiles. That's widely available. People also know kind of they are expected to research. People don't know they're expected to bring in grant income or be world leading. You know, we have spoken about Rank and Yank and UCU, and not just UCU, but lots of people have spoken about Rank and Yank. And if we compare to the financial services industries, we know anyone who goes into work for a Goldman Sachs or for somebody else, they expect that. It's fully well known. If you don't bring in X amount of money, you are gone. That comes with the territory. This has never come with the territory. It is, it is a fundamental shift about what is expected as people's work, and the fact it is being used to threaten livelihoods and threaten employment status is where the problem of a university trying to launder their reputation. You know, we don't want you caught in the crosshairs in this discussion at all. But there is also a very severe danger of a university trying to use an organisation such as DORA to say, we can threaten employment status because it matches this of DORA, putting aside employment law and putting aside their agreed kind of role profiles and expectations that completely supersede any kind of, you know, as you say, non-regulatory body. But the messaging of that is very dangerous, and I think it is one that people within that forum need to begin to think about very clearly on how employers could weaponize that and use that to threaten people's livelihoods and existence. And I think that's one kind of thing that really needs to come to the forefront right now. Probably, I think this is at the crux of this particular issue, and my suspicion is it won't be the last either of of attacking livelihoods in this way. So I do think it is something that needs serious consideration quite quick if it isn't being given already.
Okay, I mean, I think you make a good point, and you know, given the limitations on our particular scope for action, I think that is a risk that we currently live with regard to other organizations. And certainly DORA has, you know, in the past, you know, there's been a lot of cynicism expressed that, well, such and such a body or organization has signed up to DORA. It's an entirely cynical PR move. And you know, that is something that we consider very carefully, but it is something that presents a difficulty for us in terms of what exactly we do about it. We encourage, and I think we're going to get stronger on this, every organization that signs up to DORA to actually publicize on their web pages exactly what that means for them as an institution, because actually their staff want to know, because if the institution is changing the rules around how it's going to conduct research assessment, and if, you know, people have been playing the game well under the old metricized system, then they're usually not happy about DORA coming along. So I do hear what you say, and I do take it very seriously, and it is something that we will definitely reflect on as an organization.
Just bring James in because he's had his hand up for a while. He had a question for you.
Well, I just wanted to sort of speak in support really of Stephen's very difficult. I mean, I think Dora and Stephen have found themselves in a very difficult position, and I sort of sympathise with them. And I realise it's frustrating, and you know, I understand the questions that are being asked of sort of the use of Dora by the university, as it were, to defend its position, which I think is unfortunate. And clearly, Stephen wasn't, by his own account there, aware that that would be the case. But I think this points to a deeper limitation of all of these sort of self-governing bottom-up sort of voluntary initiatives. I mean, we aren't, the same applies to the Forum for Responsible Metrics, you know, we aren't in a position to act in any sort of forceful regulatory way, nor necessarily is it a good idea that we are. I mean, I think, you know, if we take a step back from the specifics of this, the autonomy of universities as institutions that essentially, you know, govern themselves within a well, I mean, arguably already too onerous, but still relatively light touch government regulatory framework is, I think, a very precious feature of the system. And so it's set against the sort of cause for whether it's Dora or the Forum or anyone to kind of come in and sort of, you know, force things to happen. We need to set that very important principle, you know, on the other side. And of course, that's not much comfort when the university and its leadership are acting in a way that we disagree with, or we consider malign or even corrupt in some instances. I'm not saying here. And we need recourse to you know, to other sources of action, including, of course, the UCU and you know, the trades union movement generally. But we need to be a little bit careful what we're wishing for in terms of a sort of the imposition of these frameworks in a hard way, because they were only ever designed as relatively soft sort of voluntary governance initiatives. And I mean, you know, Stephen, I mean, let me just say, I mean, no one in British higher education, as far as I'm concerned, has done more than Stephen Curry to stand up for the kind of approach to research assessment that we all want to see. So while it's, I think, unfortunate that Dora has found itself perhaps more inveigled in this particular situation than it would ever have wanted to be, I think, you know, you can just speak to Stephen's own personal integrity. I mean, I know he's invested a lot of personal time in trying to get to the bottom of what's going on and trying to sort of intervene in ways that are helpful. So I think I just wanted to sort of offer my support to him in what is clearly a very difficult situation.
Yes,
but I don't feel that I'm being attacked or got at. Every single question that I have been asked or every comment that's been made is fair play as far as I'm concerned. So but I'm afraid I am going to have to go. I have
of course.
Family that I don't want to break. See if there's any one final thing that anyone wants to ask, but otherwise I do have to leave, I'm afraid.
Does anyone have a last? Any more questions?
There was one more question that was going to Stephen in the chat, which is from Georgina Turner. Can Dora not ask for the university to retract its claim? I mean, given that you did not give them permission to share what was said publicly, is that something that we could ask on your behalf, or something you would support, Stephen? Or
I mean, they have paraphrased what I said. Maybe the best thing is for me to share with you the text of what I wrote, and then that puts it in the public domain, so it's clear for people to see what I said.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for coming, Stephen.
Good luck. Okay.
Thanks so much. Okay. We have somebody has their hand up here. I don't know if they want to come in and if it was a question for Stephen or. No? Okay.
Sorry, were you calling on me then, Colin?
Yes.
Oh, 5ALF, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's Marie. Marie, I don't know why that's happened on my Zoom.
Okay.
I really just wanted to take the focus away. In fact, sorry, put my video on. I was eating before, which is why I kept my camera off. Apologies. I really just wanted to take the focus away from Stephen, but he's gone now anyway. But I think the lesson to be taken from this, from everybody, whether it's Hong Kong principles or Leiden or Dora or wherever it may be, is to be wary of those who don't always act in good faith. You can't rely on that, and to be aware that you may be drawn upon and misused and misinterpreted and misappropriated in that sense. So perhaps that's the lesson out of it for going forward, really, because it's put him in a difficult position, obviously, which nobody wants to have that as an individual, but I certainly want to be wary because it has a stamp of authority on it, I think. As soon as somebody takes that up, that has that stamp of authority. And there's been, Colin, if I could just repeat, for a good while before the hands were up, Kira wanted to ask a question as well, but I don't know if that's been superseded. I know it's hard to keep your eye on the chat as well as hands and everything. So
sorry, I was just trying to get through the questions for Stephen specifically before he
yeah, I don't know if hers was, but she's been.
Oh yeah, Kira, right at the top there. Kira has a question. So. Do you want to come in, Kira? Hello?
Sorry, Colin. Dave actually had covered most of that ground, and it was for Stephen anyway, so you can
okay.
Someone else.
I think Susha in the chat wanted to come in and say something about the Senate.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Susha, would you like to come in?
Hello there. Yes, thank you to all the panel members. This has been really great. Just because James mentioned governance structures in the higher education system here in the UK, I just wanted to take a step back and make a point on how the situation at Liverpool indicates a broader problem in the governance structures in our higher education systems. So the University of Liverpool, at the University of Liverpool, Senate now has the ultimate responsibility for the university's research and teaching policies, and that includes restructuring procedures. So I'm a member of Senate, and at our last Senate meeting, together with other colleagues in Senate, with the support of other colleagues in Senate, I submitted a paper to Senate proposing to withdraw the threat of redundancies because the redundancies are so clearly using irresponsibly research metrics. But the Vice Chancellor, unfortunately, did not allow that proposal to be discussed or to go to vote at Senate. So, I mean, it's too big a problem to deal with right now in this meeting, but I think it is important to bear this in mind, and that there is really now a tension between academics within the university and the international community and senior leadership at Liverpool. And there's clearly widespread concern on how the University of Liverpool proposals are going to impact long-term damage to our work and our disciplines in this deep way. And yeah, just I guess we appreciate any support that panel members can give us in raising that, because even within our governance structures, we're not able to do so.
So I think that comes back to the issue of which authority should be appealed to, right? DORA can't be expected to be authority, but they're functioning because there's an absence of the usual oversight structures are no longer functioning, I guess, to relate it to the broader point.
I think, Paul, sorry, I don't know if you've seen this call, but I think there's a question from Paula Williamson that might bring in other panelists as well. Yeah.
So Paula asked if the other speakers could comment on what they understand transparency to mean. It's a word that's been used by a number of speakers. James, I can see you there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, when we had transparency as one of the principles in the metric tide, and by using it there, we were arguing that a critical feature of a framework of responsible metrics usage, which was the sort of overarching framework that we put forward in that report, that a key pillar of a responsible approach to using metrics, as one of the other questions said, I mean, the metrics themselves, and Ludo said this as well, I mean, they're not intrinsically or inherently malign or bad. It's all about how you use them in what context. So as part of that framework for responsible use, transparency means that those who are being evaluated using metrics should be fully aware of the indicators and criteria and weightings that are being applied, and should also be able to independently test and verify those results, so that they can feed back if there's a feeling that they're being used inappropriately. So those seem to me, I mean, as several people have said, David as well, that seems to have been a fundamental failure of this process. I mean, the fact then that the metrics or the criteria keep jumping around and changing, I don't think that sort of rights the original wrong. And I think in a process like this, I mean, by far the best outcome would, as Susha's motion to your Senate suggested, would have been to just scrap the whole flawed exercise and consign it to the dustbin of history. Now, I mean, I don't think you can really correct this process at this point by introducing transparency at the 11th hour, because I mean, the confidence has been lost. So that would be my personal view.
Ludo has his hand up. So
yeah, about the transparency point, it's also an important thing in the Leiden Manifesto. So we emphasize it. For instance, when you use metrics, people should indeed, as James also just mentioned, be able to see the underlying data, make sure the data is correct, so that the metrics indeed give the expected outcome. At the same time, I also want to give a kind of warning, because I think if we insist on full transparency in all respects, then essentially the only way in which we can get there is by having a fully metrical system. That's the only way in which you can really make things perfectly transparent, and that's probably not what we want. So for me, we need to reflect a little bit deeper on what transparency means. And I think transparency in the end means not so much that you by necessity should know in advance in full detail how the assessment will be done. But instead, what you need to have is a situation where all the evidence that at some point plays a role in the assessment should be accessible to everyone involved, so that you can have an open and honest discussion about what that evidence actually tells us, how it should be interpreted, a kind of equal playing field, rather than one party having access to all kinds of information that the other party does not have, and that the other party therefore also cannot object against. So that's for me, I think, the essence of transparency.
Thank you. So Paula had a question following up on that. So it says, should transparency also encompass an explanation as to why a particular criterion has been selected? If anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, for me, that would definitely be part of transparency. So that's a way to actually not to require this full 100% transparency that, as I just tried to argue, is, I think, not necessarily beneficial. But this would be a way indeed to find a kind of balance between requiring transparency at a kind of intermediate level where indeed the criteria themselves should be properly justified, and there should be a possibility to debate whether these criteria make sense, to object against them, and all of that. So I think that's indeed the type of transparency that we need.
Yeah, I agree wholly with Ludo on that. I think it is an important part of transparency.
Thank you. Any other panelists? David?
I think it also speaks to vision. So not only transparency, but the why of, why the metrics were selected also goes towards what's the strategic vision that's behind it. And I think, that's one of the things that me and the other 47 people, the other 46 people, we've, had questions about what's the vision behind this? What's the purpose behind this? Because we just can't even see, the rationale. Usually if you can even see a vision, a long-term plan, you can kind of at least have empathy for it, even though you might disagree with that vision. But in this case, I felt like there's not really transparency or vision behind the selection.
Thank you. So I'm trying to take some more questions from the chat before I near the floor, because I'm conscious I missed people who've asked me questions ages ago. So Matthew Billington has asked, I think it's a big broader question, so it's addressed to everyone. Do you think we are moving towards a world of responsible metrics-based redundancy? Or have the University of Liverpool senior management crossed the line and got this wrong? So I guess what I think is interesting there is the question of, is this a trend that we're going to see across the sector, or have they done something that is out of step? I know we're asking people to make predictions here, but James, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact we're all here and the fact that this case has attracted so much attention is a reflection of the extent to which Liverpool is out of line with the general, broad thrust of accepted good practice. So I very much hope it isn't the beginning of a trend of responsible metrics-based redundancy. I'd be horrified if that were the case. I mean, I think we will all of us involved in these sorts of initiatives, Dora, the forum, we'll all reflect hard. I think the threat that's been well outlined in this discussion just now as to the misuse, as it were, of these sorts of initiatives, which of course isn't unique. I mean, one sees similar things that go on in respect of, greenwashing various environmental commitments or other such behaviors. We need to be conscious and perhaps more alive and alert to that danger. But I don't think this is the beginning of a big trend. I think, I, in broad terms, see a lot of progress and actually a lot of recognition in government, which wasn't there 5 or 10 years ago, about the pitfalls of going towards very narrow, homogenized assessment systems for research. So, by no means am I complacent or, looking at this with rose-tinted spectacles. There's lots of problems in the system still to be addressed, but I don't think that this is the beginning of a. I hope very much it isn't the beginning of a trend. That's
good, reassuring to hear. So I told people that we would be stopping at 8:30. I don't know what, so I guess we should start thinking about wrapping up. Before we do that, I just wanted to raise the question of where we go next. Sorry, yes, Maria has a question. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, it's not exactly a question, it's more a comment. And I'm thinking, for me, this whole conversation has been very painful in certain ways, because in a way, like a whole reality of people that are not being ranked, for instance, is completely kind of neglected. A lot of people on precarious contracts are losing their jobs while we're speaking, and nobody's speaking about their metrics. and a lot of them enter other people's metrics because they're hired to do research paper for somebody or to do teaching while somebody else is doing research and so on and so forth. And I think like if we carry on working within their framework, which is metrics are useful, we're actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like this is something that we have to really rethink of how we think about metrics. It's not only about transparency, it is about how it has been weaponized to divide us, to make it impossible for some categories of staff to even be in solidarity with others because they're invisible in metrics and rankings. And I mean, there's already so much written in higher education studies, critical sociology of knowledge and so forth, how much rankings are worth, and they're worth about zero, like on all possible levels. But we carry on playing this game and being in this, perpetual self-gratification of, oh, we're actually really Russell Group and I don't know what, while post-1992 universities are before closure on the same kind of flawed logic. So I think we really have to move this discussion in a different direction. And I'm a bit dissatisfied with how it's gone so far.
Thank you very much. Did anyone want to come back on that? Defend the use of metrics in rankings, or? Okay, I'll hand over to David.
Well, no, it was just to kind of, I mean, what Maria said there, I think reflects like a deep kind of problem that we've got here, and in a way, I would like to get into that kind of discussion that Maria raised, but we do probably have a much more important job, which is to make sure, to paraphrase James, that this is consigned to the dustbin of history, and that we do make sure that we don't allow the metrics that we're facing now to sack people. I'm sensing I'm not assuming that's a consensus amongst us here, but I do also maybe want to reiterate the point that if Liverpool do get away with this, it will be worse for everyone and much worse for casualised staff, of course, and it will actually casualise everyone. I mean, that's a point that we continually make, because your permanent contract is worth nothing if you can be ranked and yanked for anything that you've not ever been, for any measure you've not even been told about. So I think that's where we have to think very practically. So I was only going to suggest that maybe if people are happy with their name being used, their email address that we've got just as a kind of mailing list, because I think one of the things we would want to do is involve people here if they want to get involved in making Liverpool see sense. And I suppose I'm putting that to this meeting. Would it be a useful thing for people in this meeting for us to use the mailing list to maybe get names, because we've got a lot of international names here and a lot of people who are involved in the research metrics community, and I think together that's quite a powerful voice. So if people are happy with that, I think we would like to use your email that you've used to register for this event to ask you to contribute to a supporting statement for the people here. And it also means we can invite you to other events that we've got coming up over the next couple of weeks. This is not going to go away either in terms of, we can't see Liverpool immediately reversing it tomorrow. And that's why we are talking about escalating this action to make sure this doesn't become practice across the sector. So if you don't want to, we can send out an email to everyone who's at this meeting, and if you don't want to be involved in any of that, just let us know and we'll take you off the list. That's one thing. But there might be other suggestions here before we go.
David, do you want to share a link to the letter, or should we put that in an email later? Or
I'll put it in an email later, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, I saw Dorothy asked, are there any representative of Liverpool Uni administration present here? I'm going to guess if there are, they're not about to speak up. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers and to everyone for coming. And as David said, we'll be in touch by email with an opportunity to opt out. I'm not sure how we're going to work that, but I'm sure we can. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.